There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode is about real-life events. It contains adult themes and language. Listener discretion is advised.
It's a warm morning in August 2009 when 26-year-old Dalia Dippolito decides to go to the gym. Dalia has long brown hair, tanned skin, and has only recently started working out. She leaves her house just before 6 a.m. and drives the 2 kilometres from her house in Palm Beach, Florida, to the local gym. In the months prior, she'd started exercising with her husband, 38-year-old Michael Dippolito. They'd been married less than a year, and to anyone who knew them, they seemed happy. But that morning, in the middle of a Florida summer, Dalia received a phone call. It was a detective, and she was instructed to return home immediately. What she saw as she drove down her street was a crime scene. There was police tape and police cars, and a detective tasked with the job of telling Dalia what had happened. But by that evening, Dalia's entire world had been turned on its head. Sitting in the police station, it was almost as if she'd been visited by a ghost. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. And this month, we're looking specifically at women who kill. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Elizabeth Parker, the lead prosecutor in the Dippolito case. She's also the co-author of Poison Candy, which takes you behind the scenes of this fascinating trial. So I want to begin on the early morning of August 5, 2009, when newlywed Dalia Dippolito receives a phone call from a local detective. What does he say and how does that morning unfold?
Dalia's at the gym and she receives this phone call from Sergeant Detective Frank Ramsey. And Sergeant Ramsey gives her just enough information that he lets her know that something's happened to her husband, Michael, and that she needs to come home right away. He tells her this with such urgency. She tries to ask him for more details, and he said, basically, I just need you to come home right away. So she leaves the gym, which is less than a mile from where she lives in the townhome with Michael Dippolito. And as she arrives and pulls her truck up to almost in front of the townhome, she's met with several police officers. She sees a crime scene. The front door of her townhome is open. There's crime scene tape. There's police officers everywhere. There's black fingerprint dust all over the front of the door. And the scene starts to unfold as this imminent crime scene that the police are needing to speak with her right away. They escort her out of the truck and she is brought to Detective Sergeant Frank Ramsey, the person that called her on the phone. As Sergeant Ramsey then tells Dalia that her husband has been killed, he does it in a very matter-of-fact way, but as he says, I'm sorry to tell you, your husband has been, before he gets the word killed out of his mouth, she's doubled over, she's wailing, she's falling into his arms, and she's putting on the performance of a lifetime before he's even finished his sentence.
They then ask her to come back to speak to local detectives about who might want to hurt Mike, if he had any enemies. Did she have any answers as to what motive there might be for killing him?
When Dalia's brought back to the police station and is questioned about who might have wanted Mike, her husband, killed, she starts to rattle off this list of people. She plants all these seeds of, he's been to prison before and he's made enemies and he's hung around with the wrong guys. And she just is pointing the finger at anybody and everybody that had anything to do with Mike's life. And she does that in an effort to deflect any suspicion that the police might have had that she was behind the murder of Mike Dippolito.
What had Mike been incarcerated for previously?
So Mike had a very substantial drug problem for many, many years. It started back when he was a young boy. And at the very core of that drug problem, it just took hold of him. And he was at the point where he was feeding it in any way he could. And he basically worked in a kind of boiler room situation where they were selling foreign currency to people, and the foreign currency never existed. So basically they would take money from people and he would just take that money and use it for his drug addiction. He would spend a lot of it on women. It was not a very sophisticated crime. It was something where they just said, we're selling foreign currency. Here's the numbers. Here's how much you could make to invest. And then he would just outright take the money. They didn't even try to cover their tracks at all.
Suddenly, during that interview with detectives, the detectives turn on Dalia. How did that take place and what was her reaction when she realised that she was their prime suspect?
Well, during the interview with Dalia, she was questioned many times about whether or not there was any problems with her and Mike, there were any financial problems. And she acted like the perfect newlywed, that they had no problems. She lied right to detectives' face that there were no financial issues. And they slowly began to confront her and said, well, you wouldn't want anything to happen to your husband, would you? You didn't want to have him killed, did you? And when she says no to that, that's when they confront her. And the sergeant that was interviewing Dalia brought in the undercover police officer in handcuffs, and he stands Officer Woody Jean in front of Dalia and says, well, do you know this guy? And she looks right up at this undercover officer that she had actually hired to kill her husband. And when she's looking him in the face, she denies even knowing him. She denies ever seeing him. And they asked her, well, why was he coming out of your house? And she shakes her head and she says, I don't know. And at that moment, she's confronted and they said, listen, the gig is up. He's an undercover police officer and you're under arrest for solicitation to commit first-degree murder.
So they've got this undercover policeman. What other evidence had they been collecting on Dalia over the weeks prior?
They have collected an overwhelming amount of evidence. It started with a former lover of Dalia, Mohammed Shihada, who she had asked to help her find someone to kill her husband. And she had tried to take Mohammed's gun in an effort to maybe kill Mike herself. And it was at that point that Mohammed, as a confidential informant, told the police officers, told the detectives everything that Dalia had done and that she was trying to have her husband killed. So that was the first real set of information that they had. And then the detectives planted a video camera in Mohammed's car, and he went and met with Dalia, and they captured that first meeting on video, and they captured the audio of it. And in that meeting, Dalia hands over pictures of Mike for the hitman. She hands over money to Mohammed that was the down payment to have Mike killed. And she tells Mohammed exactly when and where and how she wanted Mike to be killed. Then law enforcement gathered multiple additional phone calls between Mohammed and Dalia where they discussed the plan, they discussed the plot to have Mike killed, they discussed where and when. And then they had an undercover officer pose as a hitman, and he met with Dalia in a car that was wired for sound and for video. And during that meeting, they discussed how Mike would be killed, when Mike would be killed, the amount of money. And Dalia said she was 5,000% sure that she wanted to have him killed. And it's that evidence that law enforcement confronted her with during her interview, and she denied all of it. She said she didn't do anything. She didn't want him killed. She said she was not guilty of conspiring to have her husband killed.
Why do you think that Mohammed went to police? Because they knew each other, him and Dalia. Why do you think that he decided to tell the police what her plan was?
I think Mohammed's motives weren't 100% altruistic. I think Mohammed was concerned that Dalia had gotten him a little too wrapped up in this plan to have her husband killed. I believe that Mohammed was the one that was assisting her in planting drugs on Mike and in his car. I believe that Mohammed assisted Dalia in trying to find a hitman earlier, some gang members that he introduced Dalia to. And I think when Dalia took or attempted to take the gun out of Mohammed's car, he realized that she really was serious and she was crazy enough to actually kill her husband herself with the use of his gun. And I think at that moment, Mohammed went into self-protection mode, into self-preservation mode, and he realized that if something happened to Mike, that all of what he had done thus far to assist Dalia was going to blow back on him, and that, he was going to be a co-conspirator and an accessory. And I think he was trying to prevent that from happening.
The planting of drugs is really significant because Mike was on probation. So if he got in trouble with the law, then it was particularly serious. In the weeks before, a few strange things happened in terms of run-ins with police. Can you talk us through some of those?
So in the weeks before the actual hit or the actual undercover officer was brought into the plan, Dalia had tried desperately to have Mike arrested for another crime, and most specifically arrested for having possession of drugs, because he was on probation and on probation for an additional 30 years. The sentence that he would have received if he had picked up a law violation or an additional charge would have been very significant. He could have served up to 30 years in prison. So in the weeks prior to the incident where the alleged hit was to happen, Mike was stopped by law enforcement on 2 occasions when he was walking to his car, and drugs were found on his car. The first time, law enfortement got an anonymous tip, an anonymous call, when Mike was with Dalia, and they were staying at a hotel that no one knew where they would be. As Mike is coming up to the side of his truck and getting his truck from valet, law enforcement officer approaches him and says that they got an anonymous call that he was selling drugs out of his vehicle. And, Mike, of course, was extremely upset and nervous because he knew what was on the line if they did find drugs in his car. But he gave them permission to search because he knew he didn't have any drugs in his car. And on that particular day, the law enforcement officer did not find that there was actually a bag stashed in the gas tank And if they had opened the gas tank, they would have seen a bag of pills, of cocaine, of Xanax, and he would have been arrested and would have gone to prison. A few weeks after that, Dalia and Mike were again at a location that no one was aware that where they would be. Last minute, they had decided to go to a restaurant. And as they were leaving the restaurant and walking to the parking garage, as they approached the vehicle, the truck that Mike had been driving, law enforcement were searching with a drug dog, and they were looking underneath the vehicle. And again, they had received an anonymous tip that he was selling drugs out of the vehicle, and there would be drugs in the vehicle if they would search it. It was at that moment that they did find cocaine underneath the wheel well of the truck. But the officer, in speaking with Mike Dippolito, believed wholeheartedly that he was not responsible and that it was a setup. And she actually believed, from my conversations with her, that the wife, that Dalia, was responsible for planning those drugs.
Did Mike suspect Dalia?
After the second incident, Mike realized that not only at the hotel did no one know they were there, but now at this restaurant that they had gone to, the only person that knew where they were was Dalia. He asked her point blank, did you have something to do with this? Did you plant drugs on me? So he started to become suspicious after the second incident that Dalia was behind trying to have him arrested and his probation violated.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Elizabeth Parker, the lead prosecutor in the Dalia Dippolito case. I want to look a little bit at who Dalia was before she met Michael. What did she do for a living, and what had her previous relationships been like?
It seemed that Dalia had for quite a long time been in the sex industry, whether she was selling herself or whether she had graduated to actually running girls herself as an escort. I had gathered during my investigation an awful lot of ads put up by Dalia on Craigslist and Backpage and a website called eros.com. And it seemed like it had been many years, starting when she was 18 years old, that she had used her body in some sort of fashion to get money and to get men to do whatever she wanted.
And how did her and Mike actually meet?
Mike actually ordered Dalia off of a website to come to his home and spend time with him. So he had ordered her as an escort.
And did their relationship then progress quite quickly in terms of them marrying and sort of the intensity of the romance?
The relationship between Mike and Dalia was a whirlwind romance. From the moment that he met her, I think it was the next weekend, they became inseparable. Mike was married at the time and quickly sought a divorce. And within 6 months from meeting Dalia, he had married her. They, by all accounts, were head over heels for each other.
I'm interested in how Mike perceived their relationship. You write in the book about a faked pregnancy, manipulation by Dalia. Even at times it seemed a bit on and off. Did he think this relationship was healthy and okay? Was he surprised when this plot came out?
I think what was so interesting about the relationship with Mike and Dalia is that Dalia really seemed to hone in on what Mike had been missing from his life for so long. He had been missing somebody that loved him and cared for him and was a caretaker and appreciated him. Mike never felt real love from the way that he was raised, being from a family, a long history of substance abuse. And so Dalia really just kind of filled that void for him. And I think that made Mike really look past so many red flags. But what Mike always said to me is that they got along so well. They had so much fun together. Dalia was sweet to him. She was wonderful. She was kind. She opened herself up to him, and he was a part of her family. There was really nothing until the planting of these drugs started that was a red flag for him. It was an absolute fairy tale until it wasn't, until it became a nightmare. And when the police showed up at Mike's doorstep on August 5th of 2009 and told him that his wife had plotted to have him killed, and she had actually hired an alleged hitman to accomplish this, it hit Mike like a ton of bricks. But at the same time, everything made sense. Now, everything over the past 6 months, from when he had married Dalia until this day, fell into place, and he started to put the pieces together. All the red flags, all the manipulation, everything that she had done finally made sense.
There'd even been an incident where she'd tried to poison him, hadn't there?
There was an incident where she tried to poison him, and we learned about that first from Mohammed. Mohammed told detectives that Dalia had put antifreeze in Mike's Starbucks iced tea, and that she had brought it to him and that he drank it and got really sick, but that he didn't drink enough of it to actually poison him. So independent of that conversation that law enforcement had with Mohammed, they then asked Mike, hey, did anything ever happen unusual with iced tea? And Mike basically tells the same kind of story where he says Dalia brought him Starbucks iced tea and he took a sip of it and that he spit it out. It tasted awful. And he got sores in his mouth and was sick for about 10 days. He was very, very sick, but that he had only had that one sip. So law enforcement put two and two together and realized that Mohammed and Mike were talking about the same incident, and it was a week or two before Dalia actually hired the hitman. So it was like she tried to kill him with the iced tea, and that didn't work. And so her very last resort was to hire somebody to kill him.
The question then becomes about motive, I suppose. And in the months before, it was discovered that she'd been manipulating him into transferring her money and sort of refinancing their lives a little bit. Is that what it looked like, that this was a way to get his money?
I think Dalia saw Mike from the very, very first moment that she met him as a really easy target. And I think she thought Mike had a lot more money than he really did. And her plan was to marry Mike and then have him arrested and send him back to prison. And then while he was in prison, that she could take all of his money and quickly divorce him and, be done with him while he served his years in prison. So Dalia started that plan when she told Mike that she would help him pay off of the restitution that Mike owed to the victims of his scam, of his financial crimes. And so Dalia convinced Mike that she was going to be the one that would pay off his restitution debts. And so that if he transferred his money to her, then she would then pay the lawyer, and it would look better. It would look like it was coming from her and not from him. So they wouldn't really question the source of the funds if Dalia was the one that paid the restitution. And so Dalia convinced Mike to slowly over about the course of a month to give her $100,000. And it was at that point that she was supposed to send the money to the lawyer. And that's when all of the incidents started happening with the drugs and the attempts to have his probation violated and all of these things. And when Dalia was unsuccessful at that, and Mike confronts her about the money, she then comes up with some fake story about reversing a wire and investing the money, and then she's pregnant. And it was one thing after another to try to get Mike to not realize that she had been stealing money directly from him. Her goal was to get the house. Her goal was to get all of his money and to get him arrested and put in jail. And when she was unsuccessful at that, and her time was basically up, where she'd told the lie that she was pregnant. And so now 3 months, 4 months in, she's not showing. And Mike wants to go to the doctor's appointments. And she's stolen all his money. At that point, she's desperate. The only option that she has is to have him killed.
So the evidence couldn't be more damning. And when this case goes to trial, what does Dalia's defense attempt to argue? How do you try and defend these actions?
Dalia's defense was that what's on the video is on the video. Because how do you say she didn't do it? How do you say, no, that's not her? You can't. She's caught red-handed. She's on the video. It's her words. It's her face. She's plotted. She's planned. She's done everything. She's given money to the undercover officer, to the hitman. She's done everything. She's dead to rights. They couldn't say she didn't do it. They couldn't say it wasn't her. So they had to say, yes, she did it, but here's why. And what they came up with is this was actually just a stunt. Mike was in on it. Muhammad was in on it. This was an opportunity for them to get noticed and for them to get a reality television show, because that was Dalia's dream. You know, she wanted to be an actress. So that's what we heard in the opening statement at the trial, was that this was a stunt for a reality television show, which was so bizarre. But at the same time, it was a little bit scary because it was just crazy enough that maybe you could convince, or maybe the defense could convince a juror that that was the truth and that that's the reason that she did this.
And weirdly, it had been filmed for the show Cops, hadn't it?
It had been filmed for the show Cops, which was, I think at the time, the longest running reality television show. And the Boynton Beach Police Department had allowed Cops to be part of the behind the scenes of putting this case together, not as their typical ride along with the police officers in real time when crimes are happening. They got a behind the scenes of the plotting and the planning and all of the evidence in advance of Dalia being arrested. It certainly caused some difficulties in the trial and in presenting the case to the jury. You know, we had to fall on the sword and admit that maybe that wasn't the smartest thing to do.
Absolutely. And what was Dalia ultimately charged with?
Dalia was charged with solicitation to commit first-degree murder with a firearm.
And what is the sentence for that?
Maximum sentence of 30 years in prison.
And she then appealed, didn't she, and actually had some time out of prison?
She appealed, and what was interesting is the reason for the appeal was that during jury selection, the potential jury pool was questioned about what, if anything, they had learned from the media prior to stepping foot in the courtroom. Had they been predisposed to ruling or to deciding the case in one fashion or another based upon what they had heard? And one of the jurors said that he had heard that Dalia had tried to poison her husband before she hired the hitman to kill him. And that evidence at the time was allowed to come in. We had argued outside the presence of the jury, and I was successful in convincing the judge that that evidence could come in about the iced tea and about the attempted poisoning. But I felt that it was questionable evidence and that it maybe wasn't as strong as the other evidence I had in the case. So I decided to withhold that and to not present it to the jury so as not to create an issue on appeal. And ironically, it had been reported in the media. And so when this particular juror mentioned that to the rest of the jury pool, that ended up tainting the jury, is what the appellate court said. So the evidence that I thought was potentially going to cause an issue if I had brought it in on appeal actually ended up giving Dalia a new trial, because the appellate court thought that that tainted the rest of the jury pool and that they potentially found Dalia guilty of solicitation to commit first-degree murder based upon that one comment made by the juror.
And what did that follow-up trial find when she sat a retrial?
So the second trial, there was a hung jury. They were unable to come to a decision. And then Dalia was retried for a third time. And that third trial, she was convicted and sentenced to 16 years in prison.
And finally, I wanted to ask, do you know what Dalia's life looks like now? Is she still denying that she had anything to do with this plot on Mike Dippolito's life?
Dalia has maintained her innocence all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. She has blamed everybody from the police to myself to Mike Dippolito. Everyone else is to blame except for Dalia.
Elizabeth Parker worked as a prosecutor for the Palm Beach County State Attorney's Office from 1998 until 2011, when she opened her own victim advocacy and criminal defence firm. During that time, she litigated a number of high-profile cases, including Dalia Dippolito's case, which she details thoroughly in her book, Poison Candy. You can find a link to it in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri, and our producer is Gia Moylan. And if you want to hear more from me, you can find me on Mamma Mia Out Loud 3 times a week, as well as our new podcast, Cancelled, about who's in, who's out, and who cares in the world of celebrities.